Nicko McBrain once made tens of thousands of fans scream with just a single drum hit. But there came a day when the very hands that had kept the rhythm for Iron Maiden no longer obeyed him. It was not the sound of the drums stopping on stage. It was the body of a legend suddenly betraying him after decades of living through speed, power, and an almost extraordinary level of discipline. He was the enormous heartbeat behind some of Iron Maiden's most ferocious metal songs, fast, precise, explosive, yet always carrying his own unmistakable sense of humor. To the audience, Nicko was the funny man behind the drum kit, always laughing loudly, always telling stories, always turning the chaos of heavy metal into a living energy. But behind that smile was a journey that was anything but easy. A difficult youth, years spent proving himself in a ruthless music industry, the pressure of maintaining peak performance inside a relentless touring machine, and the health shock that forced him to relearn something that once seemed so simple: controlling his own hands. Nicko McBrain was not just the drummer of Iron Maiden. He was the man who used drums to fight against time, used humor to hide his fear, and used willpower to keep moving forward when his body began to set limits. But behind those thunderous drums, what happens to a man who has lived his entire life by rhythm when the rhythm of his own life begins to change? Nicko McBrain was born on June 5, 1952, in Hackney, East London, in a Britain that still carried the heavy atmosphere of the post-war years. The area where he grew up was not a place associated with art or wealthy families. Life around Nicko at that time was mostly pubs, construction sites, and crowded working-class neighborhoods. Many years later, even after becoming part of Iron Maiden, he still retained a very East London feeling. Talkative, humorous, and never trying to create distance between himself and others the way many rock stars of the same era did. Around the age of 10, Nicko sat in front of the TV and watched the Dave Brubeck Quartet perform. When Joe Morello began his drum solo, the boy almost froze in front of the screen, then turned to his father and said he wanted to become that man with the dark glasses. The strange thing was that the moment that changed his life came from jazz, not heavy metal. Many years later, Nicko would still recall that memory as the starting point of everything. From then on, almost anything in the house that could make a sound could be turned into a drum kit. Nicko beat on pots, pans, and even the gas stove in the kitchen. At one point, he used knives to strike the surface of the stove so much that the paint peeled off from the repeated blows, driving his parents mad because of the noise echoing through the entire house. His first drum kit was very simple, made up of only a few basic pieces. But that was enough for Nicko to spend hours sitting there, instinctively repeating whatever he had just heard. He did not learn in a formal way. Most of it came from listening, watching, and then trying to make his body move along with the sound. School was never a place where Nicko felt he belonged. He did not stand out academically, nor did he fit well with the overly rigid style of education at the time. While many people around him were thinking about stable jobs, Nicko devoted almost all his attention to music. Rock, to him, was not some distant dream of fame. It was the first thing that truly made him want to keep chasing after it. Nicko's teenage years were not entirely peaceful either. In a fight at school, his nose was badly broken and was never surgically repaired. That face would later become almost a familiar part of Nicko on stage, rough, marked by collisions, and very different from the polished rock star image of many people from the same era. By his mid-teens, Nicko had begun playing in pubs, at local weddings, and with small bands around London, such as the 18th Fairfield Walk and then Peyton Bond. Those stages did not care who would become a star decades later. Nicko's band mainly covered songs by the Beatles, The Who, and Otis Redding amid the sound of people talking, beer glasses clinking, and cigarette smoke filling the room. There were nights when he played for hours, then dragged his drum kit back to the car himself while the audience was still drinking late into the night. None of them thought they were making history. They were simply trying to play well enough to get another gig the following week. Many years later, Nicko looked back on that period as his real apprenticeship. There were no major contracts, no feeling of overnight success. What he learned lay somewhere else: how to maintain energy for hours, how to read an audience's reaction, and how quickly a band could fall apart if the rhythm began to drift. It was from those small stages that Nicko's highly animated playing style began to take shape. After Peyton Bond, Nicko moved on to play with The Axe, a band that began trying to write its own music instead of only playing covers. But those early years were also full of instability. Band members changed constantly, arguments appeared frequently, and nothing guaranteed that they would go any farther than the small pubs around London. At one point, The Axe broke up simply because of tensions between the singer and the guitarist. For Nicko, that was the first time he saw how easily a band could fall apart. Around the early 1970s, Nicko began playing with Billy Day and guitarist Michael Leslie. It was during this period that the name Nicko appeared almost because of a very random incident. At first, his family called him Nicky, after the teddy bear he had as a child. But during a recording session at a CBS studio, Billy Day, while drunk, introduced him to someone at the record company by the name Nicko. Nicko liked the sound of it, later changed the spelling to Nicko, and kept it for the rest of his life. At that time, his life still revolved around late-night drives, small studios, and packed pubs. He was not yet a star, had no money, and had no sense that the future had truly opened up in front of him. Most of the time, it was just late-night gigs that dragged on for hours, followed by more travel to another place the next day. Nicko devoted almost his entire youth to playing music anywhere there was still room for his drum kit. In the early 1970s, Nicko McBrain began stepping into the world of professional musicians in the true sense. He played in many small projects, worked as a session drummer, and took almost any job connected to drums. In 1973, Nicko appeared on an album by guitarist Gordon Giltrap, one of the first times his name appeared on an officially released product. Around the same time, he also took part in the recording of Nice One Cyril by the Cockerel Chorus. These jobs did not bring him major fame, but for the first time, they took Nicko completely out of the world of local pub bands. He began getting used to real studios, professional schedules, and the pressure of having to play accurately from the very first take. Even so, Nicko's life at that time was still quite unstable. He did not yet belong to any major band and was almost always moving from one project to another. There were periods when he would play the night before at a small club, then appear the next day in a studio for another artist. Money was unstable, and no one looked at Nicko as a future heavy metal star. While many rockers of his generation had already begun to have hits or major contracts, Nicko was nearly 30 and still living like a hired drummer trying to keep himself alive in the music world. The first important turning point came when he joined Streetwalkers in 1975. This was the first time Nicko entered a more serious touring environment, where everything operated like a professional system instead of scattered shows in local pubs. Life on the road began to take shape from this period. Night buses, cheap hotels, stages being set up constantly, and journeys that lasted for weeks. Nicko learned how to protect his strength, play steadily night after night, and keep his energy even when his body began to feel exhausted. Those years gave him a level of endurance very different from many drummers of the same era. After Streetwalkers, Nicko continued playing with various other artists before joining Pat Travers's band. The hard rock environment at this time began to clearly influence the way he played drums. The sound was bigger, the guitars heavier, and the shows demanded more physical power than before. Nicko gradually developed a style that was both fast and very active, with dense fills and a constant sense of movement behind the drum kit. In 1980, Nicko joined Trust, the well-known French hard rock band. This was a much more important period than it may appear from the outside. Trust often toured with major heavy metal bands in Europe, and it was during the 1981 tour that Nicko first met the members of Iron Maiden. At that time, Iron Maiden was beginning to explode strongly after their first success in Britain, while Nicko was still only the drummer for a French band touring around Europe. That meeting did not immediately change his life. Nicko continued moving between tours, still the drummer of a French band traveling through Europe, unaware that only a year later he would step into the biggest part of his life. In 1982, Iron Maiden faced a major change when drummer Clive Burr left the band. By then, Iron Maiden was no longer just an emerging heavy metal group from London. After the success of their early albums and the arrival of Bruce Dickinson, the band was exploding across Europe and the United States. Changing drummers at that moment was an enormous risk, especially for a band accelerating as quickly as Iron Maiden. But while many people thought Iron Maiden would choose a more famous name, they called Nicko McBrain, a drummer nearing 30 who was still wandering from one tour to another and had never truly become a star. What made Nicko right for Iron Maiden was not only his technique. Steve Harris quickly realized that he had a very special feel for rhythm, both powerful and flexible, enough to follow Maiden's complex bass structures without losing the band's natural energy. But even after being chosen, Nicko entered the band in a state where he had barely had time to understand how quickly everything was changing. One of the most famous behind-the-scenes details happened right at the beginning of Nicko's time in the band. Because Clive Burr's departure had not yet been officially announced, Iron Maiden had to hide the identity of the new drummer when appearing on German television. Nicko was made to wear the Eddie mascot costume and go on stage instead of appearing with his real face. The hardest part came immediately after that. Nicko had to learn an extremely complex set list in a very short time in order to keep up with Iron Maiden's schedule. These were no longer the small pubs or rock clubs where he had played throughout his youth. Everything was now happening in arenas and major festivals, in front of tens of thousands of fans. Nicko was almost thrown straight from the world of a hired drummer into one of the biggest heavy metal bands of that time. Many years later, he would still admit that the pressure at that moment was greater than anything he had ever experienced. In 1983, Iron Maiden released Peace of Mind, the first album with Nicko behind the drum kit. From the opening track, Where Eagles Dare, fans immediately realized the band was carrying a very different energy. Nicko's drumming was fast, dense, and constantly moving, yet still kept a very human feeling, not dry, rigid, or mechanical. By the mid-1980s, Nicko McBrain's life had almost completely changed speed. Only a few years earlier, he had still been a drummer, drifting between small tours and smoke-filled pub stages. Now, every night, he had to sit behind a massive drum kit in front of tens of thousands of fans. The tours followed one another almost without stopping. One city would end, and another stage would already be waiting in a different country only a few hours later. At some points, Nicko's life seemed to consist almost entirely of planes, hotels, buses, and the sound of drums ringing out every night. It was during this period that he began to become one of the most closely watched drummers in heavy metal among the drumming community. Nicko's drum kit grew larger and larger, covering the back of the stage with toms and cymbals. But what stunned many people was not the size of the kit, but the way he played it for more than 2 hours every night, as if his body did not know fatigue. Many drummers from opening bands would stand behind the wings just to watch Nicko play live. Some called him an octopus because it felt as if his hands and feet were appearing everywhere at the same time. While heavy metal was beginning to chase more extreme speed, Nicko almost went in the opposite direction. He did not rely on double pedals like many drummers of the same era. Most of his power came from his right foot, his hand reflexes, and the physical endurance he had built from years of playing in pubs for hours on end. That was what made Nicko's drumming always retain a very natural feeling, even in the fastest songs. It was not cold or mechanical. It felt like a man trying to drive the entire song forward with his whole body. The relationship between Nicko and Steve Harris also became the center of the band's sound during this period. Harris liked building rhythm with Nicko because he knew his drummer could preserve that sense of movement even when the song structures became very complex. Beneath the increasingly larger guitar sections and vocals, the bass and drums operated almost like an engine that never stopped. It was that combination that helped Iron Maiden move beyond the image of a British heavy metal band and become a global stadium phenomenon. The peak of that period was almost perfectly preserved in Live After Death in 1985. Iron Maiden's shows at this point began to feel as though they no longer belonged to the world of small club bands at all. The stage was enormous. Eddie appeared like a living creature amid the lights, and behind all of it was Nicko McBrain playing drums with an intensity that barely dropped for more than 2 hours every night. For many fans, this was the moment when Iron Maiden was no longer just a band becoming famous. They began to feel like a stadium machine that was almost impossible to stop. But behind those enormous nights, Nicko's body began changing in ways almost no one could see. Long concerts, dense flight schedules, and years with almost no real breaks gradually made everything blur together. There were nights when he stepped off stage and his ears were still ringing for hours because the sound had been so loud. Sometimes the vibration from the cymbals stayed in his head until the next morning. In the world of heavy metal at that time, almost no one stopped to think about what price a drummer would have to pay after decades of sitting in the middle of sound, powerful enough to make the whole body vibrate every night. Nicko almost never allowed himself to slow down. While many drummers of the same era began relying more on triggers or electronic systems to reduce the strain on their bodies, he still played the old way, using the strength of his foot, shoulders, and arms to pull the entire song forward. The audience saw the enormous energy on stage, but what they did not see was a body having to burn more each year just to maintain the same speed that had once made him an icon. In the early 1990s, Iron Maiden began entering its most difficult period since its global explosion. Internal changes within the band appeared one after another. Adrian Smith left in 1990, creating a major gap in Maiden's familiar sound. A few years later, Bruce Dickinson also left the band. At the same time, the wave of grunge and alternative rock swept into America, causing classic-style heavy metal to begin losing the position it had dominated throughout the previous decade. This was no longer the era of enormous stadiums. and the feeling that everything was only moving upward. The atmosphere around Iron Maiden at that time was completely different from the mid-1980s. The band still toured, still released albums, but the old glow began to fade in many places, especially in the American market. In the eyes of many people, Iron Maiden seemed to have moved past its greatest peak. But amid all those changes, Nicko McBrain stayed. He did not become the center of major controversies or dramatic statements. Nicko almost simply continued doing exactly what he had always done, sitting behind the drum kit and keeping the band moving forward. It was during this period that his role as a stable pillar began to become clearer than ever. As the lineup changed and the pressure grew heavier, Nicko still held on to the familiar rhythm that Iron Maiden fans had heard for many years. This was not the most glamorous period of his career. It felt more like a period of survival than victory. The band had to learn how to exist in a rock world that had changed very quickly, while Nicko continued playing with almost the same unchanged intensity. After many years at the top, he began to understand that keeping a band alive was sometimes even harder than taking it to the top for the first time. By the late 1990s, everything began to change once again. Bruce Dickinson and Adrian Smith returned, bringing Iron Maiden closer to the strongest lineup in the memory of many fans. But what was more remarkable was that this return did not only bring old audiences back. A new generation of younger fans began discovering Iron Maiden through festivals, live recordings, and increasingly larger tours. From the early 2000s, Iron Maiden entered a powerful revival that exceeded many people's expectations. Major festivals in Europe and South America were packed with crowds. The band returned to stadiums on a scale even larger than before. What had once been seen as a heavy metal group belonging to the past now began to feel like a living legend still operating at a very high level. Throughout that time, Nicko McBrain also gradually aged along with the stage. He began playing barefoot, changed the arrangement of his drum kit to suit his body better, and became increasingly focused on natural sound instead of overly heavy electronic systems. Nicko did not like the feeling of the drum kit being turned into something too mechanical. In many behind-the-scenes videos about his microphone setup and live sound, he repeatedly emphasized that the drums had to sound like a real instrument, not a programmed machine. Most of Nicko McBrain's adult life took place on the road. Planes, hotels, buses, and stages almost completely replaced the normal rhythm of a stable family life. Like many rock musicians of his generation, his married life went through quite a few changes before it truly settled down. Tours that lasted for months made maintaining a normal family life extremely difficult. When someone was almost always in another country, everything in private life also began operating on a rhythm completely out of step with the rest of the world. Nicko has two sons, born in 1983 and 1992, but he has always kept his family relatively private from the media. Unlike many rock stars who turn their private lives into part of their public image, Nicko rarely spoke too deeply about his family relationships. For many years, the part audiences saw most clearly in him was still the man sitting behind the drum kit, always loud, humorous, and full of energy on stage. The rest was kept almost entirely separate from the spotlight. Things became more stable when Nicko married Rebecca McBrain and lived in Florida. Boca Raton gradually became the place he returned to after long tours around the world. For much of his younger life, Nicko drank quite heavily, almost as a familiar part of the rock culture of that era. Long shows, post-concert parties, and the rhythm of touring meant alcohol was almost always present around the band. But in 2015, Nicko decided to give up alcohol completely after watching back an interview in which he felt he had drunk too much and no longer appeared like the person he wanted to become. That decision was not turned into a major media campaign. It happened more quietly, like a man beginning to understand that his body and his life could not continue in the old way forever. Another important change came in 1999, when Nicko converted to Christianity after an experience at Spanish River Church near where he lived in Florida. Rebecca had wanted him many times to go to church with her, but Nicko was not very interested at first. Later, he said that during one service he suddenly burst into tears and felt as if something inside him had completely changed. Even so, Nicko's life did not avoid trouble entirely. In 2003, he was arrested before an Iron Maiden show in New York after an incident involving a parking lot attendant. According to reports at the time, Nicko was accused of driving his car toward the attendant after an argument related to access to a VIP area, injuring the other person. He was charged with offenses related to assault and reckless endangerment before being released to continue performing that night. This was almost the biggest scandal in Nicko McBrain's entire life, an incident very different from the cheerful image the public had associated with him for many years. But the greatest conflict in Nicko's life ultimately did not come from scandal, drugs, or the media. It came from his own body. After decades of playing drums at an almost extreme level of intensity, Nicko gradually began to feel his physical limits more clearly. His ears were affected by the loud sound he had endured for decades. His back and leg muscles began changing with age. And then the stroke in 2023 appeared like the moment that forced him to face the greatest fear of a drummer directly, losing the ability to control the very hands that had defined his entire life. In recent years, age has begun to show more clearly on Nicko McBrain's body. After decades of standing in the middle of the extremely loud sound of heavy metal, he has had to use hearing aids as his hearing has gradually been affected over time. Back problems have also appeared more often, especially after many decades of sitting behind a massive drum kit with almost unchanging intensity. Even Nicko's movement on stage began to slow down compared with before. But for most of that time, he still tried to maintain the touring rhythm as if his body had not truly grown old. At the beginning of 2023, everything changed suddenly. Nicko woke up one morning and realized that his right arm was almost no longer responding normally. When he tried to raise his hand and then let it go, he watched it fall without being able to control it. For most people, that would already have been a major panic. But for a drummer who had lived through the movement of both arms for more than half a century, that fear was many times greater. There was a period when Nicko lay in a hospital bed, just trying to move each finger, telling himself that his body had to respond again. The stroke left him partially paralyzed from his right shoulder down to his arm. At times, Nicko could barely hold a drumstick. Doctors later said that the most remarkable thing was not only the extent of his recovery, but his willpower throughout the treatment process. Nicko entered a physical therapy program lasting about 10 weeks, with one single goal: to return behind Iron Maiden's drum kit. When the band began rehearsals for the new tour in May 2023, no one was truly sure whether he would be able to play a full show. But Nicko still returned to the stage. He completed the tour with Iron Maiden, even though those very close to him understood that his body no longer functioned the way it once had. Some movements became more difficult. His recovery was not completely absolute. But what moved many fans was the fact that Nicko almost refused to let the stroke become the final full stop to the largest part of his life. At the end of 2024, Iron Maiden performed in São Paulo in Nicko's final show as a touring member of the band. In front of tens of thousands of fans, Bruce Dickinson stepped onto the stage and said that Nicko would stop touring after more than 40 years. The atmosphere at that moment did not feel like an ordinary farewell. It felt like an era was closing. Bruce asked the audience to turn the rest of the night into a celebration for Nicko and everything he had brought to people for decades. For many metal fans, it was one of the most beautiful and emotional farewell moments in the history of this genre. At present, Nicko lives in Boca Raton, Florida, in a much quieter rhythm of life than the period of constant touring. He spends time on golf, Jaguar cars, aviation, and family, interests that have followed him for many years. Although he no longer tours with Iron Maiden, Nicko is still an official member of the band and continues to take part in studio projects. Music has never truly left his life. It simply moves more slowly than before. Outside the stage, Nicko also maintains personal projects, such as the Drum One Drum Store and the Rock and Roll Ribs restaurant in Florida. Those places carry a feeling very much like the man himself, loud, friendly, and full of rock backstage stories. But after the stroke, the way Nicko looked at his own body also changed clearly. He recovered enough to continue playing drums, but he did not fully return to the way he had been before. And for the first time in his life, Nicko began to accept that age had finally caught up with him. His image today is also very different from Iron Maiden's peak era. He is no longer the almost tireless heavy metal machine behind the massive drum kit. Instead, he is an older man who still keeps the same love for the sound of drums that he had when he was still a boy sitting in front of the TV screen in Hackney. Perhaps the most special thing is that after everything his body has gone through, Nicko McBrain has still never truly lost the feeling of wanting to play just one more song. Nicko McBrain's legacy does not lie in the fact that he was the fastest or most technical drummer in heavy metal history. What has made him remembered for so long lies in the very human sense of movement behind Iron Maiden's drum kit. While many drummers of the same era gradually chased mechanical speed and an increasingly colder sound, Nicko still kept a style full of energy, but always with a natural looseness, like someone truly rushing along with the song rather than simply locking himself to the count. For more than 40 years, he became an inseparable part of the classic Iron Maiden sound. Steve Harris's bass and Nicko's drums almost operated like a continuous engine beneath the entire band. Not only fans, but many heavy metal drummers who came later also saw him as a model of stage endurance, the ability to sustain live energy, and the way to turn the drum kit into a living instrument rather than just a tool for keeping time. Nicko also never carried the image of a rock star who was too distant. He talked a lot, laughed a lot, and often appeared with the feeling of someone who still loved sitting behind the drum kit far too much. Even when age and the stroke took away part of his ability to control his body, he still returned to the stage. His greatest legacy, therefore, does not lie only in the music, but in the way he kept playing drums, even when his body began to no longer keep up with him. Many people remember Iron Maiden through enormous stadiums, the Eddie mascot, or tours that stretched across the world. But for Nicko, the most important part always seemed to remain in the drum kit and the feeling of being able to sit behind it. Even after the stroke, when his body no longer responded the way it once had, he still tried to return to rehearsal just to see whether he could still play. Not because he needed to prove anything to the public, but because that was almost the only way he knew to keep living his life. Nicko McBrain's story does not close with the image of a self-destructive rock star or a legend swallowed by his own fame. It feels like the very long journey of a man who gave almost his entire life to one sound, until his body began to move more slowly than the drums he had chased for more than half a century.